This is not a coincidence. This is not just another history lesson. This is a warning system that's been flashing red for 3,000 years, and we're choosing to ignore it. Ancient Egypt, the civilization that built pyramids touching the sky, the empire that lasted longer than any modern nation has even existed, collapsed because of economic patterns we're replicating right now in 2025, wealth concentration, infrastructure decay, currency manipulation, resource depletion. Sound familiar? What destroyed the most powerful civilization in human history wasn't a sudden invasion or a single catastrophe. It was a slow-motion financial meltdown that took 160 years to fully materialize, but once it started, it became unstoppable. And every single warning sign they had, we have today, only we have mortgage-backed securities, cryptocurrency, and AI algorithms accelerating the same ancient patterns that brought down the pharaohs. Picture this. You're a farmer in ancient Egypt around 1100 BCE. Your family has worked the same land for generations. You produce grain, textiles, fish, everything your community needs to survive. But here's the problem, you don't own any of it. The temple priests, just 30% of Egypt's land is controlled by religious institutions, and another 50% belongs directly to the crown. That means 60–80% of all productive land in Egypt is locked away from ordinary people. You're essentially a tenant farmer paying half your crop as rent to landlords who never get their hands dirty. Now let's talk about what that actually looked like. A standard lease agreement in late-period Egypt demanded between 1/4 to 1/2 of your entire harvest as rent. Then came the harvest tax, another 10% paid to either the temple or the government. So before you've fed your family, before you've saved anything for the lean season, 35–60% of everything you've grown is already gone. You're working sunrise to sunset 6 days a week, and the majority of your labor is enriching someone else. The Amen priesthood alone, particularly during the New Kingdom period, controlled approximately 1/3 of Egypt's entire land base. Think about that. A single religious organization, not producing goods, not defending borders, not building infrastructure, owned more wealth than most nations. They had their own labor forces, their own treasuries, their own private armies. They were essentially a parallel government, and they paid zero taxes on any of it. This is where the Bitcoin billionaires and tech moguls of today echo the ancient priests. Just as temple elites controlled vast estates while being exempt from taxation, today's ultra-wealthy park their fortunes in offshore accounts, use tax havens, and leverage complex financial instruments to avoid contributing to the system that enabled their wealth. The technology has changed. Blockchain instead of grain silos, venture capital instead of temple endowments, but the fundamental pattern remains identical. Extreme wealth concentration with minimal reinvestment into the broader economy. By the time Ramses III was assassinated in 1155 BCE, Egypt's Gini coefficient, the mathematical measure of economic inequality, had reached approximately 0.6. For context, that's considered high inequality by modern standards. But here's what makes it terrifying. Modern Egypt's Gini is around 0.32, the United States sits at 0.81, and China at 0.73. We've actually exceeded ancient Egypt's inequality levels. We're living in societies more economically stratified than a civilization that literally had god kings and slaves, the house-size distribution of wealth, meaning a tiny percentage of people controlled a massive percentage of resources. Sound familiar? That's because this same pattern appears in virtually every civilization that experiences collapse, from ancient Rome to medieval Europe to modern America. The mathematics of inequality are universal and predictive. Let's talk about what happens when your entire economic system is built on one fundamental assumption, and that assumption breaks. For ancient Egypt, every calculation, every harvest, every tax revenue projection, every population center was predicated on the Nile River flooding predictably every single year. This wasn't just important, it was the foundation of Egyptian existence. The Nile's annual inundation deposited nutrient-rich silt across the floodplain, making Egypt's agricultural productivity the envy of the ancient world. Then, around 2200 BCE, and again during the Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened. The floods stopped being predictable. Egypt entered what climate scientists now call the 4.2 kilo-year event, a mega drought that lasted over 150 years. Nile flood levels dropped. In some years, there was barely any flooding at all. In other years, erratic, violent floods destroyed crops and infrastructure instead of nourishing them. Here's what that meant in practical terms. Imagine you're planning your family's food security. For your entire life, for your parents' entire lives, for generations back, the harvest has been reliable enough to predict. You know how much grain you'll produce, how much you owe in rent and taxes, and how much you'll have left to survive. Now suddenly your crop yield drops by 40%, 50%, sometimes 60%. But your rent obligations don't change. The temple still wants its half. The tax collector still expects his 10%. The math doesn't work anymore. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptians died from starvation and dehydration during this period. Not hundreds, hundreds of thousands. Cities that had stood for centuries became ghost towns. Archaeological surveys show massive population declines. The corpse count was so high that administrative records simply stopped being maintained in many regions. This wasn't a recession. This was societal systems failure. And here's the parallel that should terrify us. Our modern economy is just as dependent on stable environmental conditions as ancient Egypt's was on the Nile. We assume rainfall patterns will continue, that growing seasons will remain predictable, that ocean currents will keep delivering nutrients to fisheries, that groundwater levels will sustain irrigation. But climate change is already disrupting all of these systems. California's Central Valley, which produces 25% of America's food, is experiencing unprecedented drought and aquifer depletion. The Colorado River, which supplies water to 40 million people, is at its lowest levels in recorded history. The cryptocurrency boom, the NFT mania, the meme stock phenomenon, these are our generation's equivalent of ancient Egypt's precious metal hoarding during crisis periods. When people lose faith in the stability of fundamental systems, they flee into speculative assets. It's the same psychological pattern, just expressed through different technologies. Here's where ancient Egypt's collapse story gets really uncomfortable for modern Americans, because the third stage of their downfall was about military overextension and the catastrophic financial burden of constant warfare. Ramses II and Ramses III, Egypt's last truly powerful pharaohs, spent their reigns defending the empire against relentless attacks. The Sea Peoples, a mysterious coalition of refugees, raiders, and displaced populations from across the Mediterranean, launched massive invasions. In 1177 BCE, Ramses III fought them off in one of the largest naval battles in ancient history. He won. Egypt survived. But at what cost? Military expenditures skyrocketed. Standing armies had to be maintained year-round. Fortifications needed constant upgrading. Weapons technology was rapidly evolving. Bronze weapons, composite bows, chariots, naval vessels, and each advancement cost more than the last. The defense budget consumed an ever larger share of state revenues. Sound familiar yet? By the reign of Ramses III, the Egyptian military consumed so much of the budget that other critical functions began failing. Infrastructure maintenance was deferred. Irrigation systems fell into disrepair. The administrative bureaucracy that had made Egypt function for centuries couldn't afford proper record-keeping. Government workers went unpaid. In one recorded incident, the workers building Ramses III's tomb went on strike, one of history's first documented labor strikes, because they hadn't been paid their grain rations in months. The modern parallel is impossible to ignore. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined, approximately $877 billion in 2024. Meanwhile, American infrastructure is crumbling. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives U.S. infrastructure a C grade. Bridges are failing. Water systems are contaminated. The electrical grid can't handle extreme weather. Schools are falling apart, but we keep building aircraft carriers. And just like in ancient Egypt, these military expenditures don't make the empire more secure, they make it more brittle. Egypt spent everything defending against the Sea Peoples and Assyrians, but when the Persians arrived in 525 BCE, the exhausted, bankrupt state couldn't mount effective resistance. The empire that had repelled invasions for centuries folded almost immediately because the treasury was empty and the population was demoralized. Look at the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, multi-trillion-dollar commitments that destabilized regions, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and left American military readiness actually diminished. That's the pattern. Overextension followed by collapse. Egypt did it with Bronze Age chariots. We're doing it with F-35 fighter jets and hypersonic missiles. This is the final stage, and it's the most terrifying because once you reach this point, the collapse becomes mathematically inevitable. After Ramses III's assassination in 1155 BCE, something broke in Egyptian society that never fully healed. The social contract, the unspoken agreement that if citizens pay taxes, provide labor, and follow the rules, the state will ensure basic stability and prosperity, shattered. People stopped trusting the government. They stopped trusting the priesthood. They stopped trusting the economic system. And once that trust evaporates, the behavioral patterns that held civilization together disintegrate. Tax evasion skyrocketed, people hoarded grain instead of trading it. Regional governors stopped remitting revenues to the central government. The unity that had made Egypt a superpower for 3,000 years fragmented into competing power centers. The subsequent centuries saw Egypt ruled by a succession of foreign powers: Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. The empire never recovered its independence. The indigenous Egyptian state effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful political entity. The civilization survived in cultural forms, religion, language, artistic traditions, but the unified kingdom that built the pyramids was gone forever. Now here's what's 2025 mortgage rates hovering between 6.5% and 7%, more than double the rates available just 4 years ago in 2021. Housing prices that have increased roughly 100% since 2010. Median home price in the United States is approximately $420,000, while median household income is around $75,000. That means the median home costs nearly 5.6 times the median income. For comparison, in ancient Egypt, during stable periods, the cost of housing, measured in land purchase prices relative to annual agricultural output, was approximately 3 to 4 times annual income. We've exceeded that ratio. In major metropolitan areas like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Boston, median home prices can reach 8 to 10 times median income. The down payment alone, typically 20%, or $84,000 on a median-priced home, is more than the annual income of most American households. This is creating the same psychological break that destroyed ancient Egypt. Young people look at housing prices and realize they will never own property. They see wealth concentrated among an older generation that bought homes for $150,000 that are now worth. Watch billionaires accumulate wealth at unprecedented rates while student loan debt crushes their financial futures. And they stop believing the system works for them. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates in late 2024 and early 2025, yet mortgage rates haven't fallen meaningfully. Why? Because bond markets don't trust the economic fundamentals. Inflation remains sticky around 3%, well above the Fed's 2% target. The 10-year Treasury yield sits around 4.1%, reflecting deep uncertainty about America's fiscal future. National debt exceeds $35 trillion, more than 120% of GDP. These are late-stage empire numbers. And just like ancient Egypt, where citizens watched temple priests live in luxury while farmers starved. Americans watch tech CEOs become centibillionaires while working families choose between rent and medical care. The median CEO-to-worker pay ratio in the United States is now 351.1. In 1965, it was 21-1. The mathematics of inequality are screaming that something has to give. Here's what keeps me up at night. These patterns aren't just similar to ancient Egypt. They're functionally identical. Extreme wealth concentration, environmental crisis disrupting fundamental systems, military overextension draining resources, loss of institutional trust. These 4 stages don't just describe how empires fall, they describe how our empire is falling right now. The housing market isn't just expensive. It's exhibiting the same dysfunction that marked late-period Egypt. Just as Egyptian farmers became permanent tenants on land their ancestors owned, American millennials and Gen Z are becoming a permanent renter class. Just as Egyptian temple estates hoarded land while populations starved, American investment firms like BlackRock buy up housing stock to convert it into perpetual rental income streams. The technology is different, but the wealth extraction mechanism is identical. The climate crisis isn't coming. It's already here. Hurricane damage, wildfire seasons, drought cycles, crop failures, these aren't aberrations anymore. They're the new normal. And just as the Nile's failure triggered cascading systems collapse in ancient Egypt, environmental instability is beginning to destabilize our economic foundations. Insurance companies are withdrawing from high-risk markets. Food prices are becoming volatile. Water rights are becoming the most valuable commodity in Western states. Ancient Egypt lasted 3,000 years before these patterns destroyed it. The American Empire is only 249 years old. We're hitting the same crisis points, but we're doing it faster. The wealth concentration that took Egypt centuries to achieve happened in America in just a few decades. The environmental changes that unfolded gradually in the ancient world are accelerating exponentially in ours. The military overextension that drained Egypt's treasury over generations is consuming American resources in real time. The question isn't whether we're following ancient Egypt's pattern. We demonstrably are. The question is whether we have enough time and enough political will to break the cycle before it's too late. Every empire in history has believed it was different, that it was special, that collapse couldn't happen to them. Every single one was wrong. Ancient Egypt thought so too. And if you're reading this while watching housing prices you can't afford, working a job that doesn't cover your expenses, and wondering why the richest country in human history can't provide basic stability for its citizens, you're living through the answer. The pattern is clear. The warning is unmistakable. What we do next determines whether we're remembered as the generation that learned from history or the generation that repeated it.